We have all experienced grief. In some capacity or other, we have all lost something that's been important and meaningful to ourselves. We may have lost a person, we may have lost a relationship, we may have lost a job, a material good, we may have lost time. There's a lot of different capacities in which a person grieves. And this video is going to focus on how do we determine the difference between grief and clinical depression. This comes up all the time in my sessions when I'm dealing with grief, saying, okay, I'm grieving and I'm experiencing these symptoms, but is this just grief? Is this normal? Or is this something that's more clinical? So we're going to dive into it today. Thanks for being here. I'm Laura Nicola. I'm your Faithful Therapist. So like I said, grief can look very different for very many people. People can experience the death of a same person and have different variety of symptoms or different kind of extremes of symptoms. Two people can lose their job and, one person may see it as, okay, it's a pivotal moment. God's clearly trying to tell me something. I should, embrace it and move on. And the other person might be devastated and might be showing more regular symptoms of grief, and that could potentially become something clinical. So again, the focus of this video is to distinguish between grief that's normal and, something that we all experience and something that it's important to move through and go through the symptoms of in order to process and heal. That versus something that's more clinical, which usually looks like depression related to grief symptoms. It could also turn into anxiety. It could turn into other mental health diagnoses. Somebody that's experiencing extreme stress during grief, for example, might develop, some physical health issues. But we're going to focus on the difference between grief and depression. So what is grief? How do we define it? What does it look like? And how can we, kind of acknowledge that that's something that we might be going through, or we might know that somebody else is going through? Well, grief is responding to a loss in a capacity in which we realize what we've lost, which may sound like duh, but it's important to acknowledge that there's a loss there. So when we are going through grief, we're going to have emotions correlated to that loss. So we're going to experience sadness. We're going to experience stress. We're going to possibly experience irritability or anger towards that loss. We're going to experience some level of guilt, maybe. We're going to have some level of regret. In grief language, it's called bargaining. Oh, if only I did this, maybe this wouldn't have happened. We experience some physical symptoms, maybe difficulty sleeping or difficulty eating or lack of energy, those kinds of things. Grief might temporarily impact our self-esteem or our confidence. If we lose a person that's close to us, we might say, I don't feel secure or safe anymore without this person, without their comfort. If I lose a job, I might be scared that I'm going to, not be able to financially provide for my family. That causes a fear. So these are probably sounding pretty similar to symptoms of depression, which is why it's difficult kind of deciding, okay, is this grief? Is this depression? I think a really big important factor is the amount of time that a person is going through grief. If somebody has lost a person, a loved one, someone close to them, grief is not something that's just going to be over after the first year or after 2 years. In my grief sessions, I often tell people, grief is now kind of going to be a lifelong companion of yours. And that doesn't mean that it's going to feel as extreme as it does on day 1, as it does, year 4. But in some capacity, those symptoms and that feeling of grief is going to be there. Now, clinical depression, you have to fall into, like for major depressive disorder, for example, you have to fall into pretty specific criteria to be diagnosed with that. The DSM, which is the manual for diagnosing mental health issues, kind of took out a bereavement clause related to that because they're trying to acknowledge that they seem different as well. So clinical depression might look like somebody that's not willing to accept help when going through a loss. They might have more kind of defense mechanisms present. They might avoid the issue. They might deny the issue. They may look to kind of fix the issue with diving more into work or, kind of dealing with it with substances, or something that might be more harmful to them. They also might experience more hopelessness or helplessness. The extreme sadness might be more visible than to normal, people going through grief. Or it might be less understandable to somebody that knows that person well and that's around them. They might say, oh, of course that person's grieving. But they might say, gosh, it seems a little extreme that they're going to this extent, or they're, exhibiting these symptoms if it's depression. The person that has depression also is going to experience a greater deal of guilt, probably. Sometimes not even related to the loss, just kind of more generalized. And that person is going to struggle more long term with things like self-esteem issues and low self-confidence. So, I'm not going to go through all of the criteria for major depressive disorder. That's can be easily Googled. But the point is that the symptoms are usually escalated and they usually last longer. And they're usually not as well attuned to for depression as opposed to grief. Because I think there's a kind of a normal understanding of grief. Oh, let's give this person this amount of months or this amount of bereavement time. Depression is harder to acknowledge, especially if the person going through it has a hard time expressing what's going on. So it's complicated in that way. But the point, and kind of what it boils down to is that regardless of if there's grief symptoms or it's overlapping with, depression or turning into long-term clinical depression, it's important to get help. That doesn't have to be a counselor per se, although I'm biased. And so I think grief counseling is wonderful, and counseling to rule out if it's becoming depression is very helpful. But support can also be from family, from friends, from a support group, from, kind of doing some research, or reading a book about somebody else's experience that might be similar to yours, just realizing that you're not in this alone, because that, whether it's grief or depression, is oftentimes a core thought, of nobody gets it. So I can't talk to anybody else about it because nobody else understands. Well, your specific case, of course not. But many people go through grief. Like I said at the beginning, all of us go through grief in some capacity. So it's worth trying to reach out and find that support. So I hope this was helpful. It's pretty brief. I like to keep these videos brief. But yeah, just kind of the difference between, grief and clinical depression. It's a very fine line, as you can see. So if there's any doubt, kind of do some more research, educate yourself more, or find a counselor that you're willing to kind of talk through it with, just to make sure that, you're handling it, whether it's grief or depression, as best as you can. Thanks for being here. Leave me comments, leave me questions. As always, I love hearing those. So let me know what you think. As always, follow me on my social media accounts. I'm on Instagram, I'm on Facebook. So, subscribe here, follow me there, and stay tuned for more videos. All right, many blessings.